Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible, right here on Fulfill Radio. I'm William Bell, your co-host, along with Don Preston. And today we're going to be talking about the recap of the Hester. Doing? How is the recuperation from all of the stress of the past week going, and what's on the schedule for the future?
Well, the recuperation finally started kicking in actually about today, William. I tell you, somebody asked me on Saturday, immediately after the conference, they said, well, what are you going to do now? I said, well, my wife and I are going to go home, and we're going to go to bed, and we're going to wake up sometime Monday afternoon. and that's obviously not what happened. I've actually been at the office every morning at the same time, as usual, which is around 4 o'clock, as you know, and I haven't gotten just an awful lot done. However, I tried to focus. I tried to concentrate on doing some writing that I really wanted to do and just wasn't able to do it. The brain just wasn't functioning. And so I did a little bit of disk cleanup. I would go into my hard drive, clean things up a little bit. Nothing that took any real mental ability. But like I said, today I have felt more rested and since the conference, and actually, I did some writing this morning. I tried to get on the internet. I tried to do some filming, and unfortunately, I had some technological problems that I won't explain because they're too simple. They're too embarrassing when I realized what it was, as is so very often the case with me. But nonetheless, I've got it all working now, Lord willing, and I'll be back on Morning Musings in the morning, and I'll give a little bit of a recap of the debate seminar on Morning Musings in the morning. But I tell you what, William, as I think I mentioned to you, we had our largest opening night crowd ever on Thursday night. We've never had a larger opening night crowd for any past Preterist Pilgrim Weekend. And that tells you a little bit. Some people simply do not like debates. That's all there is to it. There were actually some people there who said they don't like debates. But maybe in their mind it was a little bit like that proverbial train wreck. You don't like it, but you can't look away. I don't know if that's what it was or not, but they were there. And interestingly enough, one particular gentleman who is pretty sensitive to confrontational language and has commented to me about it in the past, came up to me. Actually, he sent me an email the following day, and he said, Don, the debate and the seminar was just great. And so I was very pleased with that. I mean, obviously, David Hester is a energetic and enthusiastic, shall we say, speaker. I'm the same way. But This particular gentleman was not at all offended. We had some people that thought it was a bit too confrontational. But the good thing about it is I don't remember a single comment being made questioning the integrity of either man, questioning the standing of either man before God. And that's the type of thing that I won't tolerate in a debate. I mean, certainly it is expected that each man in a formal public debate will press his points aggressively and press those points, press the logic or press the illogic of the arguments. But to question the integrity of the other man, to challenge his standing before God, to call names is something that I detest. I absolutely detest it. And so I'm glad that none of that was there in that particular debate.
Yes, I thought, respecting the crowd, there were a lot of people coming to me basically saying that, new people that I hadn't seen before. And that impressed me quite a bit, that there were so many people that I hadn't recognized before. Not that, sometimes I have to come a couple of times just to become familiar with the faces, but at the same time, I knew these were people who had not been there before. And, we had several preachers in the audience as well that, just let us know that there was some interest in this debate outside of, the preterist community. There were others who were interested in seeing the outcomes as well. So that was very noticeable this time.
Yes, indeed it was. I personally got to meet some of the ministers that were there. One man, I won't call his name, but he is a preacher in the Churches of Christ, and he and I corresponded some years back. He is known as a debater. He is supposedly an excellent debater, and I was pointed to him by Brother Tony Denton, who, of course, was able to be there. And Tony knew this gentleman for years and years and years and had tried to talk to him about covenant eschatology and just got condemned. I mean, just absolutely condemned. But this, pardon me, this preacher was there, and I recognized his name. We were able to chat just a little bit. I think he bought one book. But what's interesting is when he and I corresponded some years ago, I challenged him to a debate, and he just absolutely scoffed at the idea. And what is so interesting is that he considers himself to be, shall we say, an expert in debating the Sabbath issue. And, William, as you know, I raised the Sabbath issue in this debate. But back when he and I were corresponding, and I challenged him to debate me, I told him I would even debate him on the Sabbath issue because due to his eschatology of being unfulfilled, it's my conviction he ought to be observing the Sabbath. And like I said, he just simply scoffed at the idea. But we will see if anything develops from that in the future. But I suspect if he was paying attention when the issue of the Sabbath came up, that he realized that there's a major, major issue in the amillennial world when it comes to not only the Sabbath, but all of the feast days of Israel and the fulfillment of the law of Moses. And since they have an unfulfilled eschatology, and since the feast days foreshadowed the fulfillment, the final fulfillment of God's eschatological plan, for him to stand up and say the Sabbath is past is to say, guess what? The eschatological plan is fulfilled. So I don't think he's going to debate me ever. In fact, I doubt that I ever hear from him again. I may be wrong, but we'll see. But it was good indeed to see some ministers like that there. And it remains to be seen how much good was done. But I have to tell you, William, in my assessment, as I try to be legitimately objective, and I understand that as a participant in the dispute, it's not possible for me to be 100% objective. I understand that. but I really honestly tried to be objective. And it amazes me. Had a couple of people email me who have friends that were supporters of David Hester. And they emailed me and told me that David Hester's followers were saying that he won the debate. He won the debate. One of them told me that when a friend of his, actually it's a relative of his who is on David Hester's side, had watched the debate and said, "Oh, David Hester won." Well, the gentleman who contacted me, who is from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, told me, he said, "I'm not real sure he watched the same debate that I did." Because, how in the world do you say David Hester won? And as I said, as I tried to be honestly objective, honestly as fair as possible, I honestly, truthfully, do not know how anyone could say that David Hester won this debate. One of the key points that he kept making over and over and over and over again, that he said would disqualify me from the debate, is I did not read or define my proposition. And I think he mentioned that in every single one of his speeches. And of course, as I pointed out, I had made the purposeful decision to concentrate on discussing the issues. He and I had negotiated the proposition. We understood what the proposition was about. Why should I spend 5 minutes defining the proposition when he and I both agreed what the proposition was about? And yet, pardon me, yet he wanted to make that a humongous, supposedly telling issue in the debate. Instead of focusing on answering my arguments, instead of establishing an affirmative argument, he talked about Preston not defining his proposition as if that was some kind of a determinative issue in the debate. And I hope that everyone else saw that was simply an obfuscatory and evasive tactic to divert people's attention away from the fact David Hester was not answering my arguments. David Hester was not making substantive arguments. He was focusing on issues that have nothing to do with the establishment of truth. He was making arguments that are absolutely not evidentiary. And so I just, I think I turned to you on one occasion and said, he's doing nothing but waste time. And that's what I felt like he was doing.
Yeah, he kept saying that you didn't define your proposition. And at the same time, he was saying he didn't know what was being affirmed, and yet he was up trying to deny it. So that didn't sound too smart on his part. It sounded a little bit that this was, as you said, was just a ploy to divert attention from what the real issue was. And anyone who was listening to the debate could see very clearly that there was a big divide between the arguments that you made and the responses that he gave to them. I'm sure as we go along, one of the, I noticed that with the Romans 11 information, he tried to respond to that, I think maybe once, and then left it alone. Particularly after, your follow-up responses to that. But for the most part, you had to bring his attention back to it to let him know, that's what was being discussed. And I think that probably triggered the responses about not knowing the proposition, because he probably didn't know what to do with Romans 11. And then in his affirmative, he had announced the night before, as well as the day of, all that he was going to affirm. And after his machine gun attack in that first affirmative, I really didn't hear very much about anything that he affirmed after that point. It seemed like his game was totally just foiled at that point, and it was just a matter of marking time to get through the discussion.
You know, I think you've raised an incredibly important point here. On the very first night of the debate, he said, tomorrow night we are going to focus on 1 Corinthians 15. We are going to show you positively, we are going to show you without any shadow of a doubt that 1 Corinthians 15 is about the end of time. And William, on Friday night, the last night of the debate, he didn't make one, I don't remember a single argument on 1 Corinthians 15. Did he make an argument on 1 Corinthians 15?
None that I recall, and certainly none that not only was his premise or proposition that it was going to be the end of time, but it was going to be the resurrection of the just and the unjust.
Yes. And I don't even remember him saying anything about the resurrection of the just and the unjust on Friday night. And, folks, here's to give you an idea of what I would call David Hester's desperation. And there's so many things that illustrated this, and this gets back to trying to be as objective as possible. In my written questions to David Hester, I asked him the following three, and this is a paraphrase. I'll be glad to give anyone a cut and paste copy of the actual questions verbatim. But be that as it may, I said the following three verses predicted and foretold the resurrection of the just and the unjust. Daniel 12:2, John 5:28 and 29, Acts 24:14 and 15. Do all of these three verses speak of the same event, the same resurrection of the just and the unjust, or do any of these verses, do any one or do any of them speak of a different resurrection from the other verses? Or do they all speak of the same time and the same event? And his answer was they all speak of the same time and the same event. They're all the same. Okay, so follow this, ladies and gentlemen, because this is so absolutely stunning, and it shows you David Hester's desperation. It shows you how disingenuous, and the better word is desperate, okay? So I got up there during my affirmative, my very first affirmative, and I pointed out that David Hester says the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, the resurrection of the just and the unjust, is the resurrection of John 5:28 and 29. It is the resurrection of Acts 24 and 14 and 15. It is, therefore, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. And from his table, he said, I never said that. And I have to I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I had assumed, and I had told my wife, he was going to have to change his position in order to have any hope whatsoever in this debate. He was going to have to change his positions during the course of the debate and change them from the written answers that he had given me. And he said, I never said that. I never said that. And I said, yes, David, you did. And he said, I never said that. And so I pointed out to the audience, okay, ladies and gentlemen, David Hester is now saying, and I said, please catch the power of this. David Hester is now saying that the resurrection of Daniel 12, the resurrection of John 5:28 and 29, the resurrection of Acts 24:14 and 15, they are all the same event, but they are not the same resurrection as 1 Corinthians 15. So I turned to him and I said, David Hester, when you get up here, since you now take the position, since you're now claiming to take the position, that John 5:28 and 29, that Acts 24, that Daniel 12 is not the same as 1 Corinthians 15, show us the difference. Demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt, demonstrate it exegetically that Daniel 12, John 5, Acts 24 is not the same resurrection. Now look, folks, it would have been stunning beyond belief had David Hester got up there and said, no, the resurrection of John 5, 28 and 29, the resurrection of Acts 24, 14 and 15 is not the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. William, I think you would agree with me. That would have been so shocking to his brethren in the churches of Christ that he would actually have been castigated and condemned for that himself. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes, I definitely would agree with you on that. I was sitting here looking at the page of, from the questions that we had that, I handed you in the debate, which you had, of course, as well, where I had just highlighted the statements, on that particular point where he had agreed that all of these, and his answer was so emphatic because he said, like, yes, all of these do.
Yes.
So for him to come back and then to deny that certainly showed that inconsistency. And I agree. He would have had to take, a totally different position in the debate in order for him to even get up and try to affirm anything, because this was basically an admission of his entire position just going downhill. Just absolutely being destroyed. And if anybody was paying attention to that, which I know some were, but if they really got it, that was the end of his entire presentation in the debate, just on that point alone. Because, if you're talking 1 Corinthians 15, you're talking the coming of the Lord, and you're talking Daniel and all of the, Matthew 25, all of the other eschatological texts, Revelation, etc. That's the whole 9 yards. And at the same time, his denial of that and trying to, the subtlety, and I'm not trying to ascribe anything dishonest about it, but the subtlety of that denial is what made it so, unacceptable, to use kind words about it. In other words, to take Daniel 12 and John 5 and Acts 24 and say they do not refer to 1 Corinthians 15, or to deny that he'd ever said anything about 1 Corinthians 15 based on your response in calling that out and pointing that, his answer out to the question, I just thought really was an attempt to divert attention away from how devastating that position was.
And if we happen to have anyone listening tonight who takes David Hester's position, who watched the debate, listened to it, I really honestly hope, I sincerely and respectfully ask that you seriously consider what happened on this point alone, ladies and gentlemen. David Hester, when I challenged him, if you do not believe Daniel chapter 12 is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, then since you've already admitted that it is the resurrection of John 5, it is the resurrection of Acts chapter 24, then show us that difference between those verses and 1 Corinthians 15. And then, William, if you remember, I put a chart up, and I don't remember if the projector was working or not, but I put a chart up illustrating and demonstrating the perfect parallels between Daniel chapter 12 and 1 Corinthians 15. Both were Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Both predicted the time of the end. Both predicted the resurrection. Both predicted the resurrection for entrance into the kingdom. Both predicted resurrection to eternal life. Both predicted the resurrection at the end of Old Covenant Israel, because Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, emphatically and explicitly puts the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, at the time, quote, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, unquote. And 1 Corinthians 15. Now, folks, if you have not watched yet, if you haven't listened to the debate yet, please go to my website, eschatology.org. Right at the top of the page, the debate, the entire seminar is there. All of the video, the entire seminar with every speech of the debate is there. It's on BibleProphecy.com. I trust it will probably be on DonKPreston.com before long. But the point of it is, I challenged David Hester to show the difference between Daniel 12 and 1 Corinthians 15. Now remember, Daniel 12 foretold that resurrection, said it would be when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. Well, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 said the resurrection would be when, quote, the law, unquote, that was, quote, the strength of sin, unquote, would be removed. Now, in written questions, and this is a second point, upon which David Hester completely capitulated the entire debate. He lost the entire debate upon this singular point. Okay? This is just compounding his problem of Daniel chapter 12. And this is why I find it really staggering how anyone who honestly, objectively analyze the debate, analyze the arguments, could actually jump up and say David Hester won when he admits that Daniel 12 is John 5, it's Acts 24. And I'll return to that here momentarily to show you how disingenuous and how logically fallacious David Hester's argument was. But watch this, folks. In the written questions to me, or answers to me, in response to my written questions to him, I asked David to specifically define, quote, the law, unquote, that Paul the Apostle defines as the strength of sin in 1 Corinthians 15, 55 and 56. David Hester's answer was, quote, the law of Moses, unquote. Now, folks, if you really don't catch the power of that, then please watch the debate. So here was my argument. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be when the law, that was the strength of sin, would be removed. The law, that was the strength of sin, was the law of Moses, says David Hester. Therefore, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be when the law of Moses was removed. Now, catch this, folks. David Hester said over and over and over during the debate, the law of Moses was removed at the cross. Well, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that's a fatal self-contradiction. You cannot argue, on the one hand, that the law of Moses, every bit, every jot, every tittle of it was nailed to the cross, and then turn right around and say the resurrection is at the end of time, when Paul said the resurrection would be when the law of Moses, the strength of sin, would be removed. If you take that argument, you're having the law of Moses removed at two totally distinctly different, disparately different points of time for two totally different reasons. And even though David said over and over and over again that he was going to prove that the law of Moses was nailed to the cross, he never got around to proving it. He made one argument, and that was based upon the priesthood, Hebrews 7:10. But when I responded about the Melchizedekan priesthood, it pretty obviously threw him off his game. And all he did was come back and ridicule what I had said. He didn't do any exegesis. He didn't give any logical arguments. He just ridiculed what I had said. Well, folks, in case you didn't know it, ridicule is not argumentation. Ridicule is not proof. Ridicule is not logical syllogisms. And so it was extremely, extremely revealing. But I said I'd return to a point of Daniel 12. I put the chart up illustrating the perfect parallels between Daniel 12 and 1 Corinthians 15. That Daniel chapter 12 foretold the resurrection when the power of the holy people would be completely shattered. I demonstrated that the power of the holy people was nothing other than her covenant relationship with God, in other words, the law of Moses. And I pointed out that the law of Moses, the power of the holy people, was completely shattered in AD 70. And then I pointed out that here is Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, written, anywhere from 52 to 55 AD, saying that the resurrection would be when the law of Moses, the strength of sin, would be removed. He's living only a few short years away from the removal of the law of Moses, and he said to living, breathing human beings, we will not all sleep. In other words, we're not all going to die before the resurrection. The harmony, the beauty, the perfect parallels are there, and I challenged David Hester to show the difference between Daniel 12 and 1 Corinthians 15, and he made one argument of saying, well, Daniel 12 is the resurrection of some. It's not the resurrection of all. I completely stripped him of that argument. He never responded to my response, not one word. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I went back to his claim that he never said the resurrection of Daniel 12 is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Now, here was his point, and you really, really have to understand the desperation of this argument. David Hester said, you did not specifically mention 1 Corinthians 15 in your question. And my response to that, ladies and gentlemen, is so what? This whole, well, a specific word is missing, therefore a doctrine is missing, it is absolutely one of the most desperate arguments you're ever going to see and hear in your life. And so I responded to the argument in the following way. I responded to David's statement that, well, Don, you didn't specifically mention 1 Corinthians 15 in your question. Therefore, I didn't say that Daniel 12, John 5, Acts 24 are equal to it. Now, look, folks, once again, you simply have to catch how desperate that is, how illogical that is, how fallacious that is. So I got up and I made the following point. David Hester believes. And I said, if he doesn't believe it, he needs to get up here and tell us plainly. He needs to tell us clearly. He needs to tell us without equivocation. But David Hester believes that John 5, 28 and 29, the resurrection of the just and the unjust, is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. David Hester believes if he doesn't, he has to get up here and tell us he doesn't and prove the difference. He believes Acts chapter 24, 14 and 15, the resurrection of the just and the unjust, is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Now, folks, hang on to your hat, because here's the conclusion. John 5, 28 and 29 is 1 Corinthians 15. Acts 24, 14 and 15 is 1 Corinthians 15. But David Hester agrees that John 5, 28 and 29 and Acts 24, 14 and 15 is Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Now, by the way, folks, I don't know if you caught it, but we had a debate conversion. On the one hand, he had admitted, he had agreed, he had written that Daniel 12 equals John 5, 28 and 29. That Daniel 12 equals Acts 24. He admitted that, folks. And then, in pure, unmitigated desperation, he tried to draw a distinction between Daniel 12 and John 5 and Acts 24 and 1 Corinthians 15 by saying, oh, well, Daniel 12 is not the real resurrection because it's the resurrection of some, not the resurrection of all. Well, that's saying it's not John 5, 28 and 29. That's saying it's not Acts 24, even though he had written that it was. So, the argument that I made is this. John 5, 28 and 29 equals 1 Corinthians 15, David Hester. The resurrection of Acts 24, 14 and 15 is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, David Hester. But the resurrection of John 5, 28 and 29 and Acts 24, 14 and 15 is the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, David Hester agreeing. Therefore, since Daniel 12 equals John 5, which equals Acts 24, both of which equal 1 Corinthians 15, that demands, logically speaking, that Daniel 12 equals 1 Corinthians 15. And I said, David Hester, I challenge you to refute that. I challenge you to prove that wrong. He never said one single argument in response to that. And folks, he couldn't. He simply couldn't. And so as William said a few moments ago, this single argument completely and totally destroys David Hester's eschatology. Because he says 1 Corinthians 15 is the end of time. No, 1 Corinthians 15 is in fulfillment of Daniel chapter 12, John 5 and Acts 24, and yet he takes that admission, tries to turn it on its head, tries to deny it, even though it was on paper that he admitted it, and Daniel 12 unequivocally puts the resurrection of Acts 24, John 5, and therefore 1 Corinthians 15 at the time of the destruction of the power of the holy people. Game over, game, set, match. The same is true of his admission that the law of Moses was the strength of sin. William, I think I mentioned that argument in every single speech I made. And he actually said once that he was going to refute that argument completely and totally. Never mentioned it. Never so much as mentioned that argument. And then he had, may I be kind here, had the audacity to get up and say, I have answered every single one of Don Preston's arguments. Well, that drew an audible gasp and an audible chuckle and an audible, ripple that went through the entire audience. They knew that David Hester had not, under any circumstances, answered my arguments. William, you mentioned Romans 11. And you and I, of course...
I did mention Romans 11. But before going to that, one of the things that I wanted to point out as well was on his attempted quibble to respond to to 1 Corinthians 15 and the connection between Daniel. As you mentioned, he said that Daniel 12 talked about some. Well, Daniel 12 and John 5 both have some in the context.
That's right.
They all speak of some rising to everlasting life and some to everlasting shame and contempt. John 5 says all, but then it says some to the resurrection of life and some to the resurrection of damnation. So that's the continuity and connection between the two passages. And I couldn't believe that, a person would get up and affirm that. Of course, you made an excellent point as well when you talked about, he played on the term many as well, and yes. or some, and you pointed out many for the remission of sins. And so those were just some of the kind of desperation tactics that I saw. Now on Romans 11, which was just absolutely, I think, way over his head in terms of the argument itself. I'm not saying it was over his head in terms of knowing that Romans 11 is there, knowing what the chapter says basically, but in terms of using it in the debate, as you did, to point out the future of Israel, which is, that's a subject that they don't even discuss in amillennialism. Israel's future, past and present, whatever was related to Israel, ended at the death of Christ on the cross. And then from their perspective, the New Testament takes up a whole new set of prophecies that are just solely contained within the New Testament and seemingly disconnected from the Old Testament. Now, studying the Old Testament is a challenge for many Christians, period, because of, just believing they're New Testament Christians, that they shouldn't study it, etc. So that puts them at a disadvantage of knowing what's even there. And to make the argument on Romans 11 and tie it in with, Isaiah 59 to show that was the context, verse 20, 21, but also the entire chapter to set up the context for the day of vengeance, the shedding of innocent blood and the taking away of Israel's sins with the Lord coming out of Zion. All of that was to be fulfilled in a post-cross time frame and was yet future. Here was Paul still talking about that future in Romans 11. And then, of course, tying it in with Daniel 9, which was another interesting connection made in the debate, and Isaiah 25, which took you right back to 1 Corinthians. So you had the end of the law, as you just pointed out, the law being the strength of sin, which he admitted, as you stated, but that being tied to Daniel 9 to make an end of sins, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and then Isaiah 59, and he knows that you can't put 1 Corinthians 15 in a pre or at the cross time frame. So, I mean, that was like just a bomb with shrapnel and fragments all over the place in terms of that argument. And for the entire discussion, he basically just ignored it, ran from it, because, number one, I just think he didn't have a clue what to do with it, and number two, he couldn't answer it to start with.
Well, you're exactly right on Romans 11, and folks, I got to share something with you. A couple of months ago, as I began to contemplate offering and presenting an affirmative argument on the resurrection based on Romans 11, I knew and I realized at the time that the majority of the Church of Christ audience that would be there, in one way, would be lost. I understood that. I understood it was a risk, so to speak, a risk to take to present an affirmative on Romans 11. And the reason it is that way is because in the amillennial world, in the churches of Christ, I can tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, both ministers and members alike have no clue what Romans 11:25 and following actually teaches. I have heard some of the most prominent ministers in the churches of Christ get up and say, I honestly don't know what to do with this text. I have had Bible professors from leading Church of Christ colleges and universities tell me, I don't know what Romans 11:25 and following teaches. Well, I called William up. What was it? William, 2 months ago, maybe? And I said, William, what is the most ignored New Testament text on eschatology, either ignored or a matter of fear for most members and preachers in the churches of Christ. And without hesitation, William Bell said, Romans 11, 25 and following. And I said, exactly. And I shared with him what I had in mind. And I shared it with Larry Siegel. And when I asked him, what is the most ignored and the most feared New Testament text on eschatology in the churches of Christ? And he agreed, Romans 11. Even though I knew and realized that there would be a certain degree of the lesson that would be a puzzlement to the Church of Christ audience. At the same time, I wanted them to see the power of realizing that Paul's eschatology was, in fact, from the Old Testament, that it's not about the end of time. It's not about the end of the Christian age. And obviously, there was some strategy involved, and that strategy was when I asked David Hester in written questions about Romans 11, he basically scoffed at the idea that it has anything to do with eschatology. Likewise, on Daniel chapter 9, which is an integral part of the background of Romans 11. David Hester wrote 4.5 pages trying to tell me that Daniel 9 was, quote, irrelevant to our discussion of eschatology. Well, folks, the only reason he felt like it was irrelevant to our discussion of eschatology is because, without any doubt whatsoever, I mean, could I be wrong on this? Well, yes, of course I could, but I do know this. David Hester wrote on his Facebook page, which was shared with me by some of his Facebook friends, that he was saying he had been contacted by some Church of Christ preachers that had debated me and who were offering to counsel him. Well, I can tell you this, ladies and gentlemen. One of the Church of Christ ministers that I debated some years ago, I used Daniel chapter 9 as my affirmative argument. And that Church of Christ preacher basically got up and capitulated. He got up and said, I do not know what Daniel 9 says. But, of course, Preston is wrong. Well, you know, that doesn't really prove anything. You admit that the text that I'm arguing from is something you don't know anything about. But I can't be right because you don't know what it says. So, David Hester, in his 4.5 pages, told me that it was irrelevant to our discussion. Well, it is absolutely not irrelevant to eschatology, since it deals with the putting away of sin, which is what 1 Corinthians 15 talks about. 1 Corinthians 15, 55, and 56. It is the making of the atonement, which is what Hebrews 9 is all about. It is about bringing in of everlasting righteousness, which is what 2 Peter chapter 3 is all about, and Romans 8 is all about, and, you know, other New Testament texts. And I told William that I felt like David Hester had spent 4.5 pages in responding to my question about Daniel chapter 9, insisting that it was irrelevant to our discussion of eschatology because he was absolutely terrified of it and wanted to convince me that it was irrelevant so that I'd leave it alone. But instead of having that effect, it convinced me that we absolutely had to deal with Daniel chapter 9. And I want to tell you what, folks, David Hester didn't deal with Daniel 9. His desperation on this text became absolutely incredibly manifest to anyone paying attention. So over and over and over, I drove the point home that Romans 11 is absolutely not what David Hester said. David Hester says that Israel, the Israel to be saved there in Romans 11, is essentially the church at the end of time. Oh, but wait a minute. Catch this, folks. When I asked him what specific coming of the Lord is found in Romans 11, when Israel would be saved, he said there is no specific coming of the Lord in view there, and it's a mistake to think so. Okay, now wait a minute. So on the one hand, you affirm that Romans 11 is talking about the salvation of the church at the second coming of Christ, which is a pretty definite coming of the Lord in David Hester's view. But then you turn around and you tell Preston Romans 11 is not even talking about a specific coming of the Lord. Folks, this is the kind of self-contradiction that David Hester was guilty of over and over and over again in this debate. And listen to me. These self-contradictions are massive, major, fatal self-contradictions. These are so far beyond and above when it comes to the serious nature of these self-contradictions. David Hester's quibble, well, Preston did not define his proposition, therefore he would be disqualified if this was a debate contest. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a, quote, debate contest. This was a discussion of the theological issues that separate us. And instead of dealing with my arguments on Romans chapter 11, he quibbled about whether or not I had defined my proposition. And you just simply must catch the power of the argument that I made. All scholars agree that in Romans 11, Paul said, the Redeemer shall come out of Zion, for this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin, says the Lord. And he says, all Israel shall be saved, as it is written. Okay? And then he quotes from Isaiah 27. He quotes from Isaiah 59, and he echoes Daniel 9. Now, as William suggested a moment ago, Daniel 25 to 27 is a united prophecy. And by the way, William, before we leave the air tonight, I do want to share about one of the ministers that was there from what is known as one of the anti-Church of Christ groups, because it was such a telling time. But anyway, folks, I pointed out that Isaiah 27, the very verse, listen to me, the very verse that Paul quotes to predict the coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel, predicted that salvation to come at the time of the judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood, at the time of the destruction of the city, the destruction of the temple, and the destruction of the people. And I challenged David to explain that. I pointed out that it would be the time of the judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood, chapter 26, verse 21 of Isaiah. And that Jesus in Matthew 23, 29 and following said that all of the blood of all of the righteous that had been shed on the earth would be judged and avenged in his coming at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. I demonstrated the exact same thing from Isaiah chapter 59, that Isaiah 59 predicted, or it told of Israel's blood guilt, her guilt for shedding innocent blood. And when God saw it, he promised to come in judgment of Israel for shedding that innocent blood. And the time of that coming would also be the time of the salvation of the righteous remnant. And he said, for this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. That is God's old covenant promise made to old covenant Israel. And it is quoted verbatim by Paul in Romans chapter 11, verse 26 and 27. I challenged David to show his hermeneutic, how Paul in Romans 11 is quoting from Old Testament prophecies about the salvation of Israel at the time of the judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood, and yet Paul is completely, even though he quotes those verses, and even though he's quoting from Daniel 9, the promise of the taking away of Israel's sin, ending no later than AD 70, to show us, to demonstrate exegetically that Paul actually had the salvation of the church, divorced from Israel, having nothing to do with Israel, having nothing to do with Isaiah 27, having nothing to do with Isaiah 59, having nothing to do with Daniel chapter 9, but instead Romans 11 is about the salvation of the church at the end of the Christian age. I challenged him to do that, ladies and gentlemen, over and over and over again. He did not even mention Isaiah 27, Isaiah 59. And yet, once again, he got up and said, I have answered every single one of Don Preston's arguments. No, that was simply false. He did not mention that argument. And look, folks, there's so much more. I mean, literally, there are so many other points in which David Hester completely and totally contradicted himself. I've got to share one more very, very quickly. He got up in his very first affirmative. And by the way, folks, I told William months ago that I did not know how David Hester would be able to even begin to affirm a proposition such as he had signed. But what I felt like he would do, I felt like he would get up there and shotgun and machine gun a long, long, long list of arguments that would be absolutely, totally presuppositional. They would not be exegetically based. They would simply be bold-faced assertions in the form of syllogisms. Well, if it's the case that this is true, then this is true. And it is true that this is true, therefore the conclusion is unavoidable. And yet, that's so presuppositional, ladies and gentlemen, because he doesn't prove his major premise, his major hypothetical premise. Well, one of his arguments, if you wish to call it that, he said, if it is true that death was destroyed in AD 70, as Don Preston says, then the death must either be physical or spiritual. If it is physical death, there should not be any physical death today. If it is spiritual death, there should not be any spiritual death today. But there is physical death today, and there is spiritual death today. Therefore, Don Preston is false. And you know, folks, this is just a classic example in which opponents of covenant eschatology have not done their homework. They have absolutely not studied our literature. They have not read our books. They haven't read our articles. They haven't listened to Two Guys in a Bible. And it's just incredible. As William and I sat there and listened to this argument, we look at each other and we just kind of shake our head like, here we go. So I got back up. And first of all, I said, well, ladies and gentlemen, I guess I've been proven to be a prophet. I predicted that David Hester would get up. And look, folks, I've got to tell you something. He got those 23 arguments from Howard Denham. Howard Denham gave him those arguments. Now, he might have conjured up a few of them himself, but I'm telling you right now, he got those arguments from Howard Denham. Okay, I got back up, and I just took note of the fact that I had predicted that would be his form of attack. He would just simply list 23 arguments. He would not do any exegesis. He would just simply make the claim. Well, if this is true, then that over there is true. This here is true. Therefore, Preston is wrong. He wouldn't set out to prove his basic thesis at all. Folks, again, that is not proper debate. So guess what? I got back up, and I said, well, here is David Hester's argument. If death was destroyed in AD 70, then it's either physical or spiritual. If it's physical, we shouldn't have physical death. If it's spiritual, we shouldn't have spiritual. We have both physical and spiritual death. Therefore, Preston is false. And I pointed out, I said, David Hester, in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10, Paul said Christ had, past tense, abolished, from the Greek word katargeo, abolished death. So I said, David, tell us which death Christ had already abolished. And I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, David Hester's face and the face of his moderator fell off into the floor and rattled around. That's what I mean. They have not studied our writings. And very quickly, there was a minister there from what is known as the anti-churches of Christ. I won't go in to explain that. But he asked me some questions that were about resurrection and why I had cited Isaiah 27. And I said, well, brother, these are taken from what is known as the little apocalypse. And he goes, the little what? I said, the little apocalypse. He said, what's that? William, he had no clue in this world about the little apocalypse. And that is so lamentably true of so many members and preachers of the churches of Christ. Because, after all, God was through with Israel at the cross. God was through with the Old Testament at the cross. They really, literally, honestly have no clue that the New Testament writers quote from, cite, and allude to Isaiah 24 through 29 over and over and over again in their own predictions of eschatology. This brother had not a clue in the world. And he goes, well, where can I see a discussion of that? And I said, this book right over here discusses it. Well, okay. That, folks, this just simply illustrates how short-circuited amillennial eschatology truly is. But we don't have enough time to go on and on and on tonight. We've taken up all of our time for this evening. We want to thank everyone for joining us tonight on Two Guys in the Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And with that, we're going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in the Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Don Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust.